Here with me today is Brian Tokar, activist and ex-director of Social Ecology Institute at Vermont, USA. He's also a writer. Everybody here in Greece knows his book, Downward Climate Justice. The title of his lecture is Climate Justice and Politics of Resistance. And I think now that it's his turn to speak. Brian?
Thank you. Is this okay? Oh, this isn't on. Okay, now I'm on, right? Very good. Well, this is the end of a very enlightening, somewhat long, intense 3 days of conversations here in this room in Athens. So I will try to wrap things up a little bit, talk a little bit about the wider context of social ecology and movements, a little bit about my own work in climate justice and where this all could be heading. I really want to start by thanking everybody on the board of TRISE for inviting me here. I should also thank my home institution, the University of Vermont, where I'm part of the part-time academic precariat, for helping make up some of the large difference in travel costs between what TRISE was able to raise and what it actually cost. And I especially want to thank Yavor, who isn't in the room right now, for putting up with all of the complicated logistics around my trip here to Athens. It's really been an amazing week. It's my second time here, and it's always great to be here. We've had so many rich discussions over the last 3 days. It's impossible to summarize them, but in broad thematic terms, we've talked about ways to transform the way we do activism, the way we do politics, scholarship, work in cooperatives, the way we eat, the way we work in solidarity with movements in other parts of the world. We've had a persistent current of stories from two very important movements that have very strong resonances and, of course, in the latter case, explicit influence from social ecology, namely the movement of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, and the movement of the Kurdish people and their neighbors in northern Syria. These, of course, are both movements with a base in long surviving land-based cultures that have been repeatedly marginalized by the forces of imperialism and global hegemony, that have adopted ways of thinking about their future and their movements that are incredibly inspiring. In both cases, they were influenced by people who came along, in one case, in the Zapatista case, from outside the community, in the Kurdish case, from inside the community, with very orthodox Marxist-Leninist philosophies of revolution, and in both cases, the indigenous culture, the indigenous wisdom. And I use the word, there were some questions yesterday about the use of the word indigenous. In North America, our First Peoples embrace the term indigenous. So I tend to use it with the support of folks from organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network that many of us work with. Those original ideas that came in were completely transformed by the indigenous cultures and the indigenous wisdom that led them in a direction of much more open, much more participatory, more directly democratic forms. And of course, in the case of the Kurdish movement, explicitly influenced by the works of Murray Bookchin and other social ecologists. Yesterday, we heard from Federico about the notion of the ideas of social ecology as a possible toolbox from which we draw to strengthen all our movements. So I want to say a little bit, and this is material that I'm sure is familiar to many, if not all of you, but just to set the context, to explicitly state what the tools are, talk about some of the core understanding that social and environmental problems are inherently inseparable. It continues from there to root those problems in the long-standing history of hierarchy and domination in societies around the world, and the most extreme forms of hierarchy and domination that are imposed by a system of capitalism that, at its core, rejects any sense of limits to the expansion of its scope. And Murray Bookchin, writing back in the mid-1960s, before there was really any semblance of an ecological movement, was really one of, if not the first person in the West to see that fundamental contradiction between the economic system of capitalism and the patterns of the natural world upon which we all depend. And more recent scholarship, of course, has clarified for us the extent to which the discovery and exploitation of fossil fuels have been at the core of what has made it possible for capitalists to continue to believe that their system can grow and expand with no limits. So when we talk about an end to the fossil fuel era, we are of necessity talking about the end of capitalism and the establishment of a very different kind of economic and social and political system. Social ecology goes on from there to look at some of the core principles of indigenous societies around the world that give us some ideas about the underlying potentiality in human cultures to actualize notions of freedom, a broader understanding of freedom, and then explores that question in philosophical terms, looking not only at the emergence of human consciousness from the natural setting, from first nature, but also articulates a dialectical philosophy of potentiality, looking at aspects of natural evolution that realize the increasing unfolding of patterns of diversity, complexity, and freedom in evolution, and sees those as potentialities for the actualization of a free society. Social ecology then, according to Murray Bookchin's founding works, goes on to elaborate a political strategy, which we've been exploring in tremendous detail this weekend, of libertarian municipalism, confederal municipalism, communalism, as it was called at different phases of Murray's writing, that is rooted in direct democracy, a politics of confederalism, the elaboration of political strategies of communities and confederations of communities exercising dual power in opposition to the constraints of capitalism and the state. And then finally, we have the utopian dimension, which has also been explored by many speakers here this weekend. Murray Bookchin wrote in one of his early founding essays, way back in 1965, that within ecological science there is inherently a critical and reconstructive dimension with profoundly radical implications. And every one of the movements that we've heard about here this weekend clearly has those two dimensions. In the climate movement, it's often described, and this is based on writing by the French activist Maxime Combes, who many of you are familiar with, I think, who, writing in the lead up to the big street actions in Paris in response to the incredible disappointment, which was really anticipated by the most knowledgeable activists in advance, of the UN Paris climate talks, and I'll say more about that in a little bit, he and others anticipated that the actions in response to the expected disappointments of the Paris negotiations would have those two dimensions. In that context, the critical dimension was articulated in terms of the word blockadia, which you might be familiar with because it's been popularized in the works of Naomi Klein, but it was originally coined by an incredibly dedicated group of direct action activists in the southern United States who took action to blockade the construction of the southern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline. And blockadia for them is the elaboration of liberated geographical spaces in many parts of the world aimed primarily at obstructing the development of any additional fossil fuel infrastructure. And the movement to end the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure is really one of the central elements of this movement, and continues to be and needs to be, and we need to obviously end the fossil era if life on Earth is to continue to thrive. The other element, the reconstructive dimension in the lead up to Paris, was described by the French Basque word alternativa, which was actually the name of a bicycle tour that people undertook the entire summer before the Paris meeting, touring the perimeter of France and stopping to visit important sites of alternative activity all over the country. And the last I looked, the website documenting those actions at alternativa.eu was still there, so you can take a look and see what they were doing in the name of continuing to act on the relationship between the critical and reconstructive dimensions. The utopian dimension of social ecology, of course, has informed important work all over the world in areas like permaculture, the design of greener cities, and a wide array of cooperative movements and utopian experiments, back to the land movements, and many, many others. Because as much as we know that our lives are challenged by the status quo and by the accelerating climate crisis, the way to move forward is not to indulge in despair, as many writers on climate tend to do, but rather to really maintain our focus on the revolutionary possibility of a much better, a much freer, a much more satisfying way of life beyond this fossil fuel era that we're hopefully living through the last years of. So these tools of social ecology have been tremendously influential in North America and around the world. The history in the US really starts with some of the earliest ecological movements in the 1960s, responding to the extremes of air and water pollution that people were living through then. Many people in the United States believe that ecological problems were addressed at the national level by the passage of a series of environmental laws, but not a lot of people focus on where those environmental laws came from, which was basically that the responses in local communities and even on the state level, the sub-national states, to the extremes of pollution were extremely focused and extremely well organized, and cities and towns and states were passing very strict environmental laws, suing polluting corporations, and ultimately the corporations decided that they would rather live under a regime of uniform national environmental regulations than have to continue to face this proliferation of much more aggressive regulation at the local level. I think that's an important lesson for how we think about generalizing our local struggles and having influence far beyond the local level, even in the most pragmatic, policy-oriented terms. And then, of course, we talk about how these structures take us toward transforming society. To speed up a little bit, social ecology had maybe its first really sweeping influence in the movement against nuclear power, which was first very effective in Germany in the mid-1970s, in the US in the late 1970s, and began to adopt some of the decentralized structures of direct democracy and prefigurative politics rooted in ideas from social ecology. Murray Bookchin, of course, in his studies of the anarchist movement in Spain, brought the concept of the affinity group, Grupos de Afinidad, originally from the Federación Anarquista Ibérica in the 1920s and 30s. That concept and the idea of communities of activists developing their movements, developing their strategies, and even their tactics on the ground from the bottom up through councils of spokespeople from affinity groups really began on a large scale across the country. In the anti-nuclear movement, it reached an even fuller realization 20 years later in the movement against the international financial institutions like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank. And really, just the end of next month, a month from this week, in the US, we will actually, it's hard to believe, but we'll actually be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the huge street actions in Seattle that effectively shut down the meeting of the World Trade Organization in 1999. In the intervening years, social ecologists were involved in green politics, were involved in the establishment of ecofeminism, a uniquely dialectical kind of ecofeminism that rejected both the conventional views of relationships between women and nature, refusing to either reject a link and also refusing to critically embrace it, but dialectically looking at that history as a means to understand how all people could move toward liberation. And we've been involved in many other movements, taking issues around genetically engineered food to our town meetings, which are a surviving institution of direct democracy that you're familiar with if you've read Murray Bookchin's writings on the city and on the new municipal agenda, bringing this issue to our town meetings all across New England and passing resolutions that engaged people in communities all across the region in the debate around GMOs many years before those issues were being discussed in a critical way on a larger scale. And then, more recently, being engaged in the climate justice movement. Let me say a little bit more specifically about the climate justice movement and what it looks like today. And you can read a lot more about it in my book that's out on the table, of course. When I talk about climate justice, I always focus on the three core elements that have converged to shape that movement, which is still somewhat diffuse, which does not have a coherent organizational form, but in that lack of organization, there's a lot of fluidity and a lot of room for creativity at this point. The first being a wide array of indigenous and other land-based movements, primarily in the global south. The second being elements of what we in North America, and it's since spread around the world, call environmental justice, which is primarily communities that have been exposed to extreme levels of environmental toxins, primarily African American and other communities of color that form the nucleus of this movement. And then third, some of the continuing elements of that anti-globalization / global justice or to use the French term, altermondialisme, which really more specifically invokes that idea that another world is possible. In English, we sometimes say alter globalization, but that kind of sounds awkward. But we continue to use it because the alternative-seeking dimension of that movement, which of course was really the beginnings of the current wave of explicitly anti-capitalist organizing, largely inspired by the Zapatista movement in the 1990s that spread around the world. So climate justice contains these elements. It embraces a systemic critique of the root causes of the climate crisis. It is vehemently critical of a wide array of capitalist false solutions to the climate crisis, both technological solutions like nuclear power and so-called biofuels and outrageous geoengineering schemes that have been proposed for re-engineering the atmosphere, as if we can make interventions that would be more predictable than the consequences of the climate change that we're already seeing, that we already know is proceeding at a much faster and much more chaotic pace than scientists were predicting even 10 or 20 years ago. Climate justice systematically highlights the disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis upon those people around the world who have been historically marginalized, who are far less responsible for the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And in the introduction to my new book, Climate Justice and Community Renewal, which will be out in the spring from Routledge in London, I also address the question of who is really responsible for the excess emissions and the disproportionate consumption of the wealthiest people in the world, and also of specific institutions. We now have data that allows us to point our fingers very clearly on the specific corporations, both private and state-owned in some cases, that are primarily responsible for continuing to destroy the climate. So these are all dimensions of the climate justice movement. Another one that I'll mention is the embrace of the idea of energy democracy, which has really been pioneered by progressive trade unionists around the world and really focuses on the need to return control over our energy system to the public sector, but not just any old public sector, but community-controlled, directly democratic institutions at the local level. And climate justice functions as an explicit critique of some of the dominant tendencies of the mainstream environmental movement and the mainstream climate movement. I already mentioned the critique of capitalist false solutions, which, by the way, this is very important, not only include those technologies, but also the second dimension of the false solutions discourse, the whole array of financially oriented capitalist false solutions to the climate crisis. Some of us have spent many years challenging carbon markets around the world, questioning, as we heard in the question earlier, the implementation of so-called carbon taxes, which elites around the world have really put forward as an alternative to a more publicly controlled, more publicly regulated energy system. They believe that by placing a small surcharge on emitting industries, which are inherently regressive unless there are very specific, very carefully crafted measures to counter that regressive tendency, which don't exist in hardly any of the carbon tax schemes around the world. But in any case, these financialized approaches to climate solutions fall under the umbrella of false capitalist solutions that the climate justice movement has consistently resisted. Many people in the climate movement, as we've heard from other speakers, primarily base their strategies on appeal to the state and other authorities, embrace the idea of renewable energy of any kind as an alternative to the fossil fuel system. There's certainly a lot of appeal to that, and the argument's been made by financial analysts that at the current pace of development of solar and wind energy, that in just a few years it will not only be cheaper than building new fossil fuel infrastructure, but will actually be cheaper than continuing to maintain and fuel even the existing fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's been very well documented by a number of financial analysts. But will capitalism invest in these technologies in a way that will serve the needs of people and the planet? I think most of us would agree that the answer to that is probably no. And I know here in Greece there are some massive scale wind power developments that are being opposed because of their effect on mountaintops. In southern Mexico, just north of Chiapas, is the state of Oaxaca, which is one of the windiest places in the world, and indigenous lands in Oaxaca are being overtaken by huge corporations from Spain and Germany and other places that want to develop commercial scale wind farms for the purpose of exporting energy to the United States and other population centers. That's obviously not the solution to climate change that we need. So where do we go from here? As social ecologists, we start from the local level. And in my next book, which was just submitted, the manuscript was just submitted 2 weeks ago, we've collected, that is I and my co-editor, Tamara Gilbertson, who works very closely with the Indigenous Environmental Network and other organizations. We've collected firsthand stories of people engaged in acts of both resistance and renewal all around the world, from agroecologists, some of whom are also social ecologists in Puerto Rico, who were in the forefront of the recovery around the massive hurricane that they experienced just a couple of years ago, to people in the city of Detroit, which has been substantially abandoned by the automobile industry that it used to be the primary manufacturing center for, and have been taking over abandoned lots and significantly abandoned entire neighborhoods and building community farms and lots of other alternative institutions coming from the organizing structures of the same African American communities that were really the most revolutionary elements of the radical auto workers movement back in the 1960s. Accounts of direct action against pipelines and other forms of infrastructure, including mega-scale hydroelectric dams that have been resisted by indigenous people in eastern Canada. Accounts of forest-dwelling people in South America and India who have not only been trying to protect their forests from extractive industries, from the timber industry and pulp and paper industry and others, but have also been resisting the UN's so-called REDD program, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, another capitalist offset scheme that basically allows corporations to invest in supposedly saving forests in places in the global south, but at the expense of displacing the people who've traditionally lived in those forests, who know how to live well and sustainably in those forests. So those are just a few of the examples of cases that this book explores. And we know that people are coming together in communities all across Europe and around the world to organize their neighborhoods and resist the the various forms of capitalist exploitation, including ones related to the fossil fuel industry. But how do we go beyond the local? How do we really take our work to the next level? In Murray Bookchin's writings on municipalism, he very clearly laid out a strategy for how to transform cities into confederations of directly democratic neighborhoods, and wrote a little bit about how to confederate cities and towns and neighborhoods on the regional level. But what about issues like climate change that, by many people's perceptions, are fundamentally global in character? This is an area where we need much more thinking, much more creativity, much more development of these concepts. We know about the concept of the movement of movements, which has been mentioned several times this weekend, with roots in the writings of many 1960s era theorists, but really goes back to the Paris Commune in the 1870s, the notion of reorganizing society as a commune of communes, translating that into our network of movements. That's one step. But to truly be organized on a large enough scale to address the full magnitude of the climate crisis, first we need to be as determined as the environmentalists in the 1960s were, enough that the powers that be will begin to see some level of substantial changes, that to agree to some level of substantial changes as a better alternative than having to continue to deal with the pressure, the kind of pressure that is coming upon them from all of our movements. But of course we need to go beyond that. So what kinds of larger institutions can we imagine that escape the problems of the militarism of the UN, that escape the problem of the bureaucracy of the European Union, of course the inherently capitalist orientation of the various international financial institutions? And we don't yet have a full image of what that might look like. One way of describing it, though, that came across in an online conversation I was recently part of through an organization called the Great Transition Initiative, and you can see the whole dialogue about globalism and localism that happened on their website, involving some really interesting thinkers from around the world. The radical anthropologist Arturo Escobar had an interesting phrase praising the social ecology approach as, instead of building institutions on a larger and larger scale from the ground up, what if we were to think of it as a process of horizontalism radiating itself outwardly throughout the world, retaining the fundamental local and municipal nature of our various movements, drawing upon the educative qualities of our local work that hopefully transcend the various reactionary so-called localist tendencies, by helping people experience what it means to actually have a say in the important decisions that affect their future and their lives, and imagining the full expression of this movement on a much fuller scale, without reproducing the problems that would inherently come from any kind of upscaling. But these are just preliminary notions.
Brian, we have 5 more minutes.
I'm going to actually end sooner than that. These are just beginning thoughts, and we really need to think much more deeply, drawing on the kind of diversity of experiences from movements and organizations around the world that were represented here this weekend, and begin to fully realize the furthest utopian potentiality of the social ecology approach, to reject the false pragmatism of many sectors of the climate movement, and really take our conversation to a much further level. I'd like to end by reading to you the last paragraph of the introduction to my new book, which I think summarizes this point better than I can spontaneously. I wrote, "Today's increasingly severe climate disruptions are beginning to universalize the sense of precariousness long experienced by the Earth's most vulnerable peoples. If current trends continue, the world could face a grim future of ever-diminishing returns and a capitalist race to the bottom, along with increasingly extreme deprivation on a global scale. But there is a better path. The odds are uncertain, and every year of global-scale climate inaction diminishes those odds. But it is more necessary than ever to sustain a hope that humanity can unite to reject the false choices imposed by current political and economic institutions, embrace the potential for an enhanced quality of life beyond fossil-fueled capitalism, and begin to realize the dream of a liberated and truly interdependent community of communities. The future of life on Earth may depend on our ability to do just that." Thank you. So I'm going to sit down, and I'll be happy to address as many questions as we have time for.
You know that Brian Tokar is a great writer. Now you already know that he's a great speaker too. So, do you have any questions?
Here, just give me a minute to get myself settled and drink a little water.
Somebody?
Thank you very much for this talk, Brian. I just wanted to maybe ask you what do you think about, altermondialism or anti-globalization movement, I think, has really passed away. And we see now there is a paradox because there is a global interaction taking place in in lots of places, from Chile to Algeria, and with a kind of spillover of the traditional organizations. So, and we also see that in the 90s, the anti-globalization movement was really a very globalized movement, but now they are like maybe more grounded thought after the insurrectional questions. And so, what would be this community of communities, and what would be different approach in front of the World Social Forum, and what would be the modalities of organization, and what would the characteristics of this organization different of the World Social Forum, and this experience that maybe have been a time, but
Should we take a few, or?
Before that, I want to mention that the speech is live streaming at the TRISE Facebook page.
Thanks. It's also linked to Magali's question. You were talking about the larger institution and criticizing the idea here. Right? Yeah. Criticizing the idea of larger institutions that would lead to reactionary localism, for instance. And I tend to agree with you on that. So it's a comment and also a question. So I agree that a larger institution will only bring the same kind of homogeneity as like the globalized world do, swallowing all experiences and creating just one homogeneous model, and in turn creating like what you call a reactionary localism, what we could call fascism. So you were saying that we start to have some answers to the question, but don't you think that the answer is already there? And I would like to to take Tanya's talk, for instance. Like the Zapatistas are now calling for global federation, and so the idea of communes, and I link that to my talk also, is that there is a necessity for that. You can't create a communes of communes without the necessity. Don't you think that the necessity is already there with the Zapatistas and the Kurds, and that these communes of communes through the dialogue between those experiences is already happening?
Thank you, Brian, very much for this presentation. You've talked about the concept of energy democracy and the work of trade unions within this field. And you didn't mention it, but one of the organizations present in this field is the Trade Union for Energy Democracy, TUIT. And well, maybe I will, and then I will come back to the. You mentioned that they are pushing for public ownership of energy, and one of the arguments is that with the question of time, the climate crisis is bringing a question of emergency and the need of action, and they say that with the scale of decarbonization that we need to go in right now, and the need for demodification, for them the solution is the public ownership of energy, but in a more national scale, and they see energy community as part of this public ownership, but not maybe not the main direction, considering the time and the necessity of the size of the decarbonization that we need to enter in. And I would like to use it to discuss this question.
Okay, all really important questions. Let's see. The global justice movement in the 90s fizzled out for many reasons. Of course, the aftermath of 9/11 and the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq played a big part. But so did the extent to which that movement was focused on pushing people to travel around the world to all of these various summits to confront them. And those confrontations were incredibly important. There was a tendency in that movement, which social ecologists were very active in, to try to pair that with more focused work on the local level. There was a formation that came out of Seattle called the Direct Action Network, and there were a number of other formations that tried to move things in that direction, and had some success spreading the ideas, but didn't really get to realize it. The World Social Forum, as you mentioned, was an important experiment, and actually the same organization that sponsored the dialogue that I mentioned on globalism and localism just published an international dialogue on the question of what happened to the World Social Forum. That's called, again, the Great Transition Initiative. and they're based in Boston. And it came out since I've been here, so I haven't really had a chance to look closely at it, but they featured views from people who were both active in the organizing structures of the World Social Forum, as well as people who were critical at various stages. And I was also in Montreal for that last one, and it was pretty chaotic, and I agree with you, didn't really feel like it was going anywhere. I think our ability to follow and understand the uprisings that are happening all over the world right now is greater than it's ever been. We have live media on a daily basis reporting from the streets of all of those places, which is something that we certainly didn't have before. But I think those electronic links often become a substitute for the kind of direct engagement that we heard about, say, last night from folks from the Internationalist Commune of Rojava, who have actually been bringing people there, and there's no substitute for actually bringing people there and engaging on a much more personal level. And I think gatherings like this need to be replicated, not just internationally once every 2 years, but maybe more regionally and nationally in the intervening years, so that we can start to build the kind of the cellular structure of these new forms of organization. And I agree with you that many elements of the new forms are in place, but also in many ways we're not there yet. This is true in the social ecology world. It's certainly true in the climate justice movement. There are many linkages. There are many people aware of each other's groups. There are people traveling to each other's actions and supporting each other's actions. And I think it's certainly the case, as you suggested, that the vision and the answer perhaps are already there. But the organizational forms, I think, and the necessity is certainly there. But the organizational forms are still very much a work in progress. About 3 weeks ago, in the United States, we had the very first continental, meaning US, Canada, and Mexico, Congress of Municipal Movements, organized by a brilliant collective of young activists, young social ecologists, who call themselves Symbiosis. It's one of the reasons I really made a point on Friday of defending the use of the term symbiosis when we were hearing some criticisms of it, because these folks are doing incredible work. They're doing things that we at the Institute for Social Ecology have spoken about for decades, but have never really had the organizational infrastructure to make happen. And these folks have spent the last 2 years creating linkages with people doing directly democratic organizing all over the US and Canada and Mexico, and representatives from about 40 different organizations, plus about another 100 at-large individuals who were also represented in the voting structure, came together in Detroit, one of the most radical cities in the United States, not that well known outside the black community, but certainly the case. And it was an important first step. There were expectations that we would come out with a very detailed organizational structure that would enable this ongoing confederation of municipal movements in North America to continue moving forward in a coordinated way. The actual process of the Congress was much messier than that. There was some pushback to some of the institutional structures, however representative and decentralized and accountable, that were proposed, and many of the people who were there felt that we need to almost start over and recreate a structure that's more fully representative of all of the people who are present. So we don't yet have a fleshed out organizational structure for an ongoing municipal confederation in North America, but we're closer to it than we've been at any time in the 30 or 40 years that we as social ecologists have been discussing these ideas. I also agree with the last questioner that the debate around energy democracy is multidimensional. I do celebrate the work of the network you mentioned, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and I'm also aware that in that network there's a real tension between people whose orientation is more decentralist and people who believe that the only way we can act fast enough is to do some form of nationalization of energy to promote renewables. One tendency in the last 5 years that has hardly been reported at all is a trend toward remunicipalization of many energy utilities and other service organizations, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, that were institutions that were privatized during the height of the neoliberal era, where the process of where privatization completely failed the people who depend on those institutions, whether they're energy utilities or transportation systems or what have you, and many of those institutions are starting to be remunicipalized. The Transnational Institute in the UK did a detailed report about a year and a half ago, and they have a map that shows the scope of this new trend toward remunicipalization. And some of the groups that are part of TUED support that. But it's an ongoing conversation, and we don't know the answer yet, and how to bring the changes we need at the scale that we need at a time when we know that statist attempts to address these problems have consistently failed us. And in my book that's on the table, I go into a lot of detail about the UN negotiation process, the events leading up to Copenhagen in 2009, which is where the representatives of the Obama administration in the US imposed this model of voluntary measures as opposed to mandatory reductions in emissions around the world. And that's what we got in Paris, and it really originated with the Obama administration's interventions 10 years ago in Copenhagen. So with the statist efforts to address the problem failing us, I think creates an essential opening to move forward much more aggressively with responses from the ground up, and using some of the organizational forms that we have and figuring out how to really take them much further, so that this image of horizontalism radiating itself outward around the world can really be actualized.
Great. So do you have any other questions?
Everybody's not exhausted. That's impressive.
I'm cheating because I was not here the whole weekend.
All right. Welcome.
That's also why maybe my question, I don't know if it's somehow out of place. I was, because during your talk, I didn't hear the words colonialism or decolonial or anti-colonial status or projects. And I don't know if those words were used in this room or how much were they used this weekend. I was not able to come. And I wonder
Okay, sounds like that will be the last question. And the short answer is yes. We have been talking about colonialism and decolonization in many contexts. We had several presentations from people who have spent intensive time working in Chiapas with the Zapatista movement, which is really one of the places that the current conversation about decolonization really began. And this is a crucial conversation in the climate justice movement internationally. Some of our comrades and friends in Canada who work closely with First Nations peoples across Canada, I think have really been in the forefront of this, and I think some of the deepest questioning of our political and cultural and even personal assumptions about our identities and place in the world as people who live in the global north are coming from people in Canada who are working in close collaboration with various First Nations communities, and people in the US are certainly learning from those experiences, and I hope people here in Europe as well. We made a very conscious choice in the book that I'm working on to feature as many Global South voices as we were able to get to agree to participate. We made the effort to polish up some of the articles because we're working with an academic publisher, and rather than imposing those constraints on the writers from the Global South, we worked with them to get the formatting of their writing into a form that we wouldn't have to worry about getting published, but at the same time maintaining the integrity of their voices, which I have long believed are the most important voices and the ones that we have the most to learn from.
So I would like to thank for your presence here, and afterwards a small gathering is going to take place, as you already know. Thank you.
Okay. Nathan, you can put off this. And just...
You. Go something. Go.
So just a final announcement here.
Some final announcements from Svante.
What? I was meaning to show, but it's not on there.
Oh,
This is restoring.
the update thing finally took over the computer.
Tell it.
Well, so this is the end, but it's not really the end. There's always a new beginning, you know. So, and in this case, we will meet all once for dinner at 8:30 at the same place where we were yesterday. So I was meaning to show here the address if you don't have it, but now the computer is.
Thanks, Svante, for the conference.
Yes, let's thank everybody. What us here. Federico, Gabor, who else?
Thank you. All of you.
Joanna as well, Joanna that is here from TRISE.
Yeah.
To keep in touch, you should check out our website, and we also, when you have registered, we have your email addresses, so we will send out like documentation, follow-up information from the conference. And don't hesitate to contact us personally right after the conference now, and also just send us an email if you're interested to keep in touch or be part of TRISE somehow.
And also, whoever is based in Athens, we can keep in touch. So we can speak later.
Or Greece in general?
Or Greece in general with deer, the rest of Greece.
I'll take the rest of the country.
And what about celebration? We say 8 o'clock, 8:30 we go to the place we were yesterday.
It was hard to find a place to fit us all,
So, and then we continue by the clubbing and stuff.
Then we can create small mini brigades that we can keep in touch and maximize fun.
For any questions about the celebration, ask Dio that has everything.
I gave all